So what I want to talk about tonight was actually inspired by a movie. Actually, to be more accurate, it was inspired by a review of a movie. You guys know I have this list on my phone, right, where I keep ideas for Dharma talks. And I've had a quote from this movie review on that list for a while now. And now I can't even remember where I found the movie review, I can't find it anymore. I'm not even sure what the source was for the movie review. But I'm going to start with the movie. I'll get to the movie review in a few minutes. The movie I want to talk about is called Arrival. Now, this came out in 2016, and it was a pretty popular movie, so you may have seen it. If you haven't, then spoiler alert, I'm not going to totally ruin it for you, but I'm going to talk about a lot of the plot. But it's an excellent movie. It's such a good movie. And even if you know a little bit about it ahead of time, I still think you'd enjoy it. So here's the setup for the story, right? So this is vaguely in the present. 12 enormous alien spacecraft appear across the planet. They're floating a few dozen feet above the ground. There's no immediate obvious danger. There's no apparent communication coming from them. The governments of the countries where they've landed start to study them. They're trying to figure out if there's any kind of threat, right? If there's any sort of danger that's going to come from these spaceships. Amy Adams, the actress Amy Adams, plays a linguistics professor named Louise, okay? And Louise gets brought in by the U.S. military, and in the middle of the night, they fly her to Montana, where the one ship that lands in North America is, and she meets up with this physicist named Ian, who's played by Jeremy Renner, and the two of them are kind of the leaders of there's a team of linguistics, and there's a linguist, and there's a team of physicists, and it's through their experience that we find out what's really going on here. It turns out that on a regular schedule, there's a door that opens up in the bottom of each of these ships so that people can come on board. So there's already been a first contact experience, right? Because people have been going onto the ship. And the aliens are there on the ship. And there's this kind of transparent barrier that the aliens are behind, because apparently they require a different kind of atmosphere. And people have been trying to communicate through the barrier with the aliens. The aliens are these giant kind of squid-like creatures, and they have 7 tentacle-like limbs. So human beings start calling them heptapods, 7 feet. They call them heptapods. And they make sounds, but they're nothing like human speech. And Louise is told that her job as the head linguist is to figure out what they're saying, to figure out a way to communicate with these heptapods. And she figures out really quickly that this is going to be impossible to figure out their speech. It's just too different from human speech. So she decides to try writing. So she writes for them. And lo and behold, it turns out that another way that the heptapods can communicate is that they can spray this kind of ink out of their 7-fingered hands that then creates these patterns that kind of float in the air that look like some sort of a design, and the designs change. So apparently there's communication happening in these patterns that they're creating. And as she begins to study these circular patterns, Louise begins to have visions of a child she doesn't know. And as she studies the language more and she begins to learn and understand it, she realizes that the language kind of doesn't have time in the same sense that human languages does. And the implication is that the aliens somehow live in the present and the future at the same time. They experience the future in some way. And as she studies the language more, her visions of this child become more frequent. She starts envisioning this child as a baby, and then as a tween, and then as a toddler, and then as a teenager, and back and forth the different experiences of this child. And eventually she experiences the death of this child. And eventually she realizes that these aren't visions, that these are memories of the future, a future that obviously hasn't happened yet, but that could happen if she makes certain choices. And eventually what becomes clear is that the whole reason the aliens have come to the Earth is to share their language, because they think that their language can be a tool that humanity can use to save itself from itself. Learning the alien language changes the brain in ways that unlock the future. And unlocking the future allows people to better understand the consequences of their actions. And that seemingly leads to peace and cooperation among the nations. So having completed their task, the alien ships just kind of disappear as mysteriously as they came in the first place. So obviously the language itself is critical to the plot of the film. And so I researched this a little bit. I looked into it a little bit. I found an interesting story from Gizmodo, which is this online thing, that claimed that the screenwriter's inspiration for the circular design of the writing system came from seeing drawings, probably for the old Peter Jackson movies, I'm guessing, of designs of the Lord of the Rings, the One Ring from Tolkien with the letters around it and all this, and that's what inspired the idea. But I have a really hard time imagining. He didn't actually create the designs. There was this production designer that did it, and I find it impossible to imagine that there isn't some connection between these circular designs and what are called inso paintings, which is an art form from Japan that's very connected to Buddhism in Japan. And the circular writing symbols that they use in the language are so close to these inso designs. This is a quote from an artist who specializes in making these designs. Drawing inso just means circle in Japanese. Drawing inso is a disciplined, creative practice in Japanese calligraphy and ink painting, usually drawn in one fluid, expressive stroke. The circle may be open or closed. Zen practitioners relate the idea to wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection. Many Japanese calligraphers exercise inso drawings on a daily basis throughout their career as an act of active meditation and also as in search of unattainable mastery. So if you look at, here's some examples, just to try to, the point I'm making. So these are examples of some of the language designs from the movie that you can see that mean different sorts of things. And then here's some examples of these inso paintings that I'm talking about, if you're not familiar with those. It's impossible to me to not think that somehow these had to have some connection to the idea of these designs. I'm not quite done ruining the plot of the movie for you, but let me get to the quote from that review. Now, this was written, I didn't put the date down, I think this was written in 2021, which will explain how it starts, what the first sentence says. One of the scariest parts about our current pandemic situation, that gives it away, is that we don't know what's next. Sure, tomorrow will probably be just like today, but long term, what happens? How bad will it be? Arrival, a gorgeous, thoughtful sci-fi film that would have won Amy Adams an Oscar in a just world, offers a different scenario. What if you knew for a fact that your choices would end in tragedy? Would you still make them for the sake of all the joy and beauty that will come before heartbreak? Now, what this is referring to, here's the bit of the plot. I need to go a little bit deeper into the plot. Those visions of this child that Louise experiences. What she comes to realize is that this child is the daughter of herself and Ian, this man that she's just met. That as a teen, this daughter will develop an incurable disease, and that Ian will leave the family. Near the end of the movie, Louise has a conversation with her daughter around age 8 or 9 or so, by looks of it, about why Ian left, why this little girl's daddy left, and why he now looks at her differently than he did before. And what Louise says is, I told him something he wasn't ready to hear. Believe it or not, I know something that's going to happen. And when I told your daddy, he got really mad And he said, I made the wrong choice. Now, the choice that Louise is referring to was to allow a foreseeable sequence of events to happen. Louise chose to be with Ian knowing that he would leave her. She chose to have a child with him knowing that the child would suffer and die as a teenager. She chose to do those things despite knowing the heartbreak that would come at the end for the sake of the happiness and the beauty that would come before the end. She made that choice because the sweetness of the experience was more important than the bitterness of its conclusion. So obviously, this is science fiction. It's fiction, but it's science fiction. Our lives aren't like that, sort of. Obviously, we live our lives in one direction. We live now in the present. We remember only the past, and that in a biased and selective way. Unlike Louise or the aliens, we don't remember the future. We don't know specifically what will happen in days or years to come, but to some degree, we do know, at least in broad terms. Certain outcomes are inevitable, right? Certain events are foreseeable. We know that the future will break our hearts. We just don't know exactly when or how or to what extent. That's what the Buddha taught. That's the problem at the heart of the Buddhist project, why we're all here. It is foreseeable that life will break our hearts. How do we live with that? So what we're back to, if you remember your cheat sheet, is the three marks of existence, right? Anatman, anicca, dukkha, without self, impermanent, suffering. Or as I just recently discovered, meditation teacher Ruth King wonderfully puts it in a much more, maybe more memorable way. Not personal, not permanent, not perfect. That's what life is like. It's not personal, it's not permanent, and it's not perfect. So I think it's safe to say that the main source of dissatisfaction, if you remember the four noble truths, right? What's the first of the Four Noble Truths? Life is characterized by dissatisfaction. I think the impermanence of things is maybe the main contributor to that, particularly of good things, right? Our young, healthy bodies don't stay that way. Our happy experiences ultimately fade. Our loving relationships inevitably end one way or another. As Bhikkhu Nyanamoli puts it, whatever is will be was. The reality of this was among the first teachings of the Buddha, right? When he set the wheel of dharma in motion in his very first sermon, he talked about the idea of the Four Noble Truths and the role of impermanence. And it was also the last teaching of the Buddha as he was about to die, as is described in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. How inconstant are compounded things, their nature to arise and pass away. They disband as they are arising. Their total stillness is bliss. So we try to convince ourselves that all of our experiences will be good, but we still buy insurance for our houses and our cars. In some ways, we act like we think we're going to live forever, but if we have any sense at all, we make sure we have a will. We find tragedy unthinkable, but yet if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that actually it's inevitable. I'm thinking now about my grandmother who had to bury two husbands, a son, and two grandchildren. I'm thinking about the mothers of Gaza, the mothers of Israel, the mothers of Ukraine and of Russia and of Myanmar and Sudan and everywhere else where there's a failure of those in power to remember a future that's peaceful. I'm thinking of those who suffer now through famine and blazing heat and through their homes being destroyed by storms or eaten by the ocean, the encroaching seas, because we can't remember a sustainable future. Some people seem to come looking for the Buddha Dharma because they think they can use it as a suit of armor. They're trying to protect themselves from pain, from the pain of life. They want to take it in doses like Novocaine to sort of become numb to their life experiences, to not feel them. And in fact, that's why the Buddha left the teachers that he originally trained with during those 6 years that he spent wandering before he achieved enlightenment, the 2 teachers that he worked with, because he realized that the practices that they taught, while they made him feel good for a little while, what they provided was only a kind of temporary relief from the turmoils of life. It wasn't a permanent thing. It wasn't a solution. It was just an analgesic. It seems like sometimes people who take it a little step further and pursue ordination as monastics do it as a way to hide from pain. Oh, I'm going to go into the woods. I'm going to go up a mountain. I'm going to gaze at my navel and get detached from everything. And so my heart will never break, right? But that's not the point. That's not the Buddha's goal. It's not even possible, really. I mean, no matter where you go, everywhere you go, you take your breakable heart with you and your susceptible mind with you. And as the saying goes, the only dharma you're going to find on the top of that mountain is the dharma that you had inside you that you took up there with you in the first place. The Buddha Dharma is not a suit of armor. It's not an anesthetic. It's a magnifying glass. That's the idea. Getting numbed out or blissed out, that's not the point at all, which is why it annoys me so much when I see Buddhist ideas and symbols and things used to advertise like marijuana dispensaries and things like that. It's just, ugh. Anyway, that's another Dharma talk. The Buddha didn't say to hide from our pain. He said to turn toward it, to face it, to study it, to take it apart. And when we do that, what we discover is that our mental experiences are like matter. If you think about the nature of matter, when we examine in smaller and smaller detail, when we take them apart into smaller parts, if you think about atoms and hadrons and quarks, and if we start taking matter apart to smaller and smaller bits, we reach a point where there's just space. There's just cool, open space. So the point of establishing a stable meditation practice is, it's not to weave ourselves a cocoon where we can hide from the world. The goal, or at least one of the goals, is to develop a mental capacity for concentration and calmness so that we can face the challenges in our everyday lives with a healthy degree of equanimity. We can maintain our tranquility in the face of those experiences, and then we can gain insight into those lived experiences without falling into unhealthy mental states, unhealthy emotional states. So I hope that what you're experiencing here at the center, what your practice is helping you to find inside yourself, in your own mind, is that kind of calm attention and a sense of peace in the opening space, finding the space between the breaths, finding the space between your thoughts. And if that's happening, and I hope that's happening, then everything we're doing together is worthwhile. Sangbol Hashipshio, may you, I, and all beings manifest enlightenment.